The rain had not let up in over an hour, and Selena Marsh stood alone on the far side of a driveway gate that used to open for her without a second thought. Behind her, down the hill, the Hartwell estate glowed gold and warm. String lights stretched across the veranda, laughter drifting out into the wet night air as if nothing at all had happened inside those walls an hour earlier. She had one bag at her feet, packed in under 10 minutes by hands too unsteady to fold anything properly. She was 7 months pregnant, soaked through her coat, and locked out of the only home she had shared with her husband for 3 years. No one came after her. No one even looked back. Now picture a different room, 6 months from that night. A boardroom on the 40th floor of a Manhattan tower, glass walls looking out over a skyline she had once only seen from the passenger seat of her husband's car. Selena sits at the head of a long table, a pen in her hand, papers in front of her that will decide the fate of more money than most people will see in 10 lifetimes combined. Across from her sits Julian Hartwell, the man who locked her out in the rain, and his face has gone completely still, the color drained out of it, because he has just understood something that changes everything he thought he knew about his own life. We are not going to tell you what is written on that page yet. Here is what Julian did not know on the night he sent his pregnant wife out into the storm to protect the woman he believed would save his family's future. Everything he was fighting to hold on to, every dollar, every deal, every fragile promise his company's survival was resting on, was already sitting quietly in his wife's hands, and had been the entire time he told himself she meant nothing to his plans. 6 months later, he would lose everything. Not because of bad luck, and not because anyone came looking to punish him, but because of a choice he made himself, in front of a room full of people, on a night he was certain no one who mattered would ever find out about. We are going to take you back to before any of this happened, back to when Julian and Selena were still husband and wife, still expecting their first child together, and still, as far as anyone in that ballroom could tell, an ordinary couple with an ordinary future ahead of them. But before we go back there, before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Let's go back 6 months to a life that, from the outside, looked like it was working. Selena and Julian Hartwell lived in a stone house on a quiet road in Greenwich, Connecticut, the kind of house that shows up in real estate listings with words like timeless and legacy, the kind of house Julian's family had owned for 3 generations. Selena was 7 months from becoming a mother for the first time. Julian was 6 months into running a company that carried his family's name on every building, every truck, every letterhead in 3 states. On paper, they had built something enviable. In person, if you looked closely enough, you would have noticed how rarely they were actually in the same room together anymore, and how little either of them seemed to mind. There are a few questions worth sitting with before we go any further into this story, because they won't fully make sense until much later. Why would a $3 billion rescue deal, one that decided the survival of 2 major companies, end up depending entirely on the approval of a woman almost nobody in this story had ever heard of? What exactly did Julian's own family, people who had shared a table with Selena for 3 years, never bother to ask her about her past? And why, in 3 years of marriage, had Selena Marsh never once corrected anyone who assumed she came from nothing? On the surface, the cracks were small enough to explain away. Julian missed 2 of Selena's prenatal appointments that spring, both times because of what he called an emergency at the plant, though neither emergency turned out to involve anything more urgent than a phone call. Selena stopped mentioning the appointments after the second one, not out of anger, but because she had learned, over the last few months, exactly how much space she was allowed to take up in her husband's calendar. She still smiled at dinner parties. She still let Margaret Hartwell correct the way she plated dessert without saying a word back. Nobody watching them that spring would have guessed anything was wrong, because nothing dramatic had happened yet. It never does, right up until it does. Keep those questions close. We are about to go back to where this all started. Long before the rain, long before the boardroom. Back to two ordinary people who had no idea how extraordinary one of them actually was. To understand what Julian didn't know, you have to go back further than the marriage. Back to a man named Nathaniel Ashcroft, Selena's father. Nathaniel built an investment firm from almost nothing in the 1980s. A firm that eventually grew into Ashcroft Capital Group, one of the most quietly influential funds on the East Coast. Nathaniel never wanted his name in the papers. He kept the firm private, avoided interviews, avoided galas, avoided anything that might turn his family into public property. Selena grew up watching her father work from a home office instead of a corner suite, learning early that real power in her father's world rarely announced itself, and that the people who talked the loudest about money usually had the least of it. Selena herself never felt pulled toward the business the way some children of powerful parents are. She loved gardens, secondhand bookstores, and cooking for more people than could comfortably fit around a table. As a teenager, she started going by her mother's maiden name, Marsh, in most social settings, partly to avoid the attention that came with being Nathaniel Ashcroft's daughter, and partly because it let her find out, for the first time, whether people liked her for herself. By the time she reached her 20s, almost everyone in her daily life knew her simply as Selena Marsh, a name with no weight attached to it at all, which was exactly how she wanted it. Nathaniel passed away from a heart condition when Selena was 26, and his will left her the majority ownership of Ashcroft Capital Group, along with one very specific condition. Any transaction the firm made above a certain size, a threshold in the billions, would require Selena's personal, private approval, no exceptions, no delegation, written directly into the trust in her father's own hand. Day-to-day operations passed to Diane Okafor, Nathaniel's longtime deputy, and the only person outside the family who fully understood how the firm actually worked. Selena stepped back from public involvement almost entirely, trusting Diane to run things, checking in quietly, signing what needed signing, and otherwise living a life that looked nothing like the one her father's obituary described. She met Julian Hartwell at a mutual friend's wedding upstate, 2 years after her father died. He didn't know who she was, not really, only that she was funny, unimpressed by his last name, and completely unbothered when he spilled red wine on his own jacket trying to make her laugh. Julian, for his part, was still 3 years away from taking over Hartwell Industries, still mostly just a Hartwell son with a job title and a corner office he hadn't fully grown into yet. Selena liked him best in those early months, before the weight of the family name had fully settled onto his shoulders, before every conversation started circling back to the company. Hartwell Industries had been built over 3 generations into a manufacturing and logistics company with plants across 3 states, the kind of business that used to define entire towns. By the time Julian took over as CEO, the company was carrying more weight than it could easily hold, squeezed by cheaper overseas competition and equipment that hadn't been meaningfully updated in over a decade. Julian's father had passed years earlier, which left his mother, Margaret Hartwell, as the family's real center of gravity, even though her name no longer appeared on any org chart. Margaret had opinions about everything, from who Julian should hire to who Julian should marry, and she rarely kept those opinions to herself. Margaret never fully warmed to Selena. It wasn't anything Selena did specifically, it was more the absence of anything Margaret could point to and approve of. Selena had no family name Margaret recognized, no social circle that overlapped with the Hartwells, no visible ambition to shape Julian's career the way Margaret believed a proper Hartwell wife should. Margaret referred to her more than once in front of other people as sweet enough, a phrase that managed to sound like an insult every single time she used it. Julian rarely corrected his mother, telling himself it wasn't worth the argument, a habit that would matter more than he realized later. There were small signs, if anyone had been paying attention. Selena took calls some evenings that she described only as estate paperwork, stepping into another room, keeping her voice low. A single framed photograph sat on her nightstand, an older man with kind eyes that Julian's family never once asked about in 3 years. Selena never lied about any of it. She simply wasn't asked the right questions, and she had long since stopped volunteering answers nobody seemed interested in hearing. Bianca Renaud entered the picture at a charity gala that spring, the kind of event where old money mingled with new money under carefully arranged lighting. Bianca was the sole heir to Renaud Global, a luxury textile house that had carried her family's name across 2 continents for nearly a century. What most of the room didn't know yet was that Renaud Global was quietly drowning, its balance sheet propped up by loans that were coming due faster than the company could cover them. Bianca had learned to smile through a room full of investors while doing the math on how much longer her family's name could survive intact. Margaret saw an opportunity the moment she watched Julian and Bianca talk business for 20 minutes straight at that gala, both of them animated in a way Margaret hadn't seen from Julian in months. To Margaret, a partnership between Hartwell Industries and Renaud Global looked like salvation, a chance to combine manufacturing muscle with a prestigious brand name and pull both families out of the trouble neither of them discussed openly yet. She began finding reasons to invite Bianca to family dinners, framing it entirely as business, telling herself and Julian that nothing about it needed to mean anything more than that. Selena told Julian she was pregnant on an ordinary Tuesday evening, in their kitchen, holding a test she had already looked at 3 times just to be sure. Julian's first reaction was warm, genuine, the kind of relief and joy that made Selena believe, for a few minutes, that whatever distance had grown between them over the past year might finally start closing. But even that night, his phone buzzed twice during dinner, both times a message from Bianca about a deal timeline, and both times he answered it before finishing his sentence to Selena. She noticed. She didn't say anything. It wouldn't be the last time. Over the following months, Julian's calendar filled up with meetings that somehow always seemed to involve Bianca directly, dinners that ran past midnight, weekend calls that Julian took from another room with the door closed. He told Selena, and told himself, that all of it was business, that the Renaud partnership was simply complicated and required a level of hands-on attention he couldn't delegate. Selena, growing rounder and more tired by the week, stopped asking for details somewhere around her 6th month, not because she stopped caring, but because the answers had started to feel rehearsed. The truth Julian wasn't saying out loud, even to Bianca, was that Hartwell Industries was in worse shape than the quarterly reports let on. Two of the company's biggest client contracts were set to expire within the year, both clients openly courting cheaper overseas suppliers, and the board had started asking questions Julian didn't have confident answers to. Margaret, watching her son's composure fray at the edges, became convinced that a formal alliance with Renaud Global wasn't just a good opportunity anymore. It was the only realistic path that kept the Hartwell name attached to a functioning company 5 years from now. Selena felt the shift before she could name it. Conversation stopped when she walked into rooms at family dinners. Strategy discussions happened around her instead of with her, as though her opinion on the business had never once been worth asking for, which, as far as the Hartwells were concerned, it hadn't been. She spent more evenings alone in the house that spring than she had in the entire first 2 years of her marriage, one hand resting on a stomach that kept reminding her, kick by kick, that whatever was happening around her, she wasn't facing it entirely by herself. Everything came apart at a gala the Hartwells hosted at their Greenwich estate in early autumn, an event built entirely around courting the Renaud family and their investors. String lights covered the veranda. A live quartet played near the pool. Nearly 200 guests moved through rooms Selena had once decorated herself, now rearranged by an event planner Margaret had hired without mentioning it to her. Selena arrived 7 months pregnant in a dress that no longer fit quite right, greeted by Margaret's tight smile and a room full of people who mostly knew her, if they knew her at all, as Julian's wife. Julian took the microphone around 10 that evening to make a toast, thanking the Renaud family for their partnership and their trust. Then, whether from nerves, from wine, or from something that had been building in him for longer than he wanted to admit, he turned the toast into something else entirely. He joked, in front of 200 people, that he'd built everything he had on his own, that some people in his life had simply come along for the ride, and he looked directly at Selena when he said it. A few guests laughed, unsure if it was a joke. Bianca did not look away from him. Selena did. The room went quiet in the particular way rooms go quiet when everyone present understands they've just watched something cruel happen, and no one is going to say so out loud. Margaret's expression didn't shift at all, which told Selena everything she needed to know about who had known this moment was coming. Selena set down her glass, thanked the nearest guest for coming, and walked out through the side door onto the veranda, into air that had turned sharp and cold in the last hour, the first hint of the storm that would arrive within the night. By the time Selena came back inside to collect her coat, Julian was already speaking with the house staff in the hallway, his voice low and businesslike, the way he talked when he'd already made up his mind about something. He told her, without much preamble, that he thought it would be best if she stayed somewhere else for a while, that the timing with the Renaud deal made things complicated, that this wasn't the environment for raising the kind of question their marriage had apparently become. He said it the way he might have announced a change to a shipping contract. He did not raise his voice. He didn't need to. Selena packed one bag, moving quickly, because slowing down felt dangerous. Because slowing down might mean she started asking Julian to explain himself, and some part of her already understood there was no explanation coming that would matter. By the time she reached the end of the driveway, the rain had started in earnest, and the gate that had opened automatically for her car every single day for 3 years simply didn't open at all. She stood there for a long moment, 7 months pregnant, soaked through, watching the party lights glow warm and steady behind her, waiting for someone, anyone, to come out and say this had all been a mistake. No one did. There is a particular kind of clarity that shows up in moments like that one, the kind that doesn't arrive as anger or grief, at least not yet, but as something closer to quiet, complete understanding. Selena stood in that rain and understood, with total certainty, exactly what she was to this family. Not a wife, not the mother of the next Hartwell. A complication, mentioned in a toast, escorted out by staff who'd been told to change the locks before the party even ended. She also understood something else, something Julian had never once thought to ask her about in 3 years of marriage. And that understanding was the only thing keeping her upright. She called one person from the back of the car that picked her up 20 minutes later. Thomas Reyes answered on the second ring, the way he always did, the way he had answered every call from her since her father died. She didn't cry when she told him what happened. She asked him, instead, in a voice steadier than she felt, to have her father's old office at Ashcroft Capital ready for her by Monday morning. Thomas didn't ask why. He'd been waiting 5 years for a call exactly like this one, and he simply told her it would be ready. Bianca watched the entire toast from across the room, and if she felt any discomfort at what she'd just witnessed, she didn't show it. She had spent months calculating exactly how much her family's survival now depended on the Hartwell name, and by that math, whatever happened to Julian's marriage was simply not her concern. She found Julian an hour later near the bar, told him the toast had been a little much, laughed when he apologized, and let the moment pass without ever once asking what would happen to the pregnant woman who had just walked out into the rain. Margaret slept well that night for the first time in weeks. As far as she was concerned, her son had finally chosen the family's future over a marriage she'd never believed in. And whatever discomfort came with the way it happened was simply the price of doing what needed doing. She had learned a long time ago that difficult decisions rarely look graceful in the moment they're made, and she had no intention of losing sleep over the optics of a toast, a locked gate, or a pregnant woman standing outside it. Julian did feel something the next morning, standing in the kitchen where Selena usually made coffee, noticing for the first time how quiet the house had become without her in it. He told himself the feeling was guilt over the timing, not the decision itself. And he told himself that once the Renaud deal closed and the company was stable again, he would find a way to make things right with Selena. On his own schedule, in his own way. It did not occur to him, not even slightly, that Selena might not be waiting around for him to get to that. Selena didn't call a divorce lawyer that night, and she didn't call Margaret, and she didn't call Julian to demand an apology she already knew wasn't coming. She went to Thomas's guest house instead, dried off, and slept better than she had in months, because for the first time in a very long time, she wasn't waiting to find out what would happen to her. She had already decided. Julian Hartwell had no idea, standing in his own party that night accepting congratulations on a deal that hadn't even closed yet, that he had just made the single most expensive mistake of his entire life. Julian and Bianca appeared together publicly for the first time within 2 weeks of the gala, at an industry dinner that Margaret made sure several reporters happened to attend. The story that circulated afterward framed it exactly the way Margaret wanted it framed, as two old, respected families finding common ground for a partnership built on mutual respect and shared values. Nobody mentioned Selena by name in any of it. Nobody needed to. She had already been written out of the story before it was even fully told. The formal merger discussions between Hartwell Industries and Renaud Global moved quickly after that, faster than either company's lawyers were entirely comfortable with, because both families needed the deal to work for reasons that had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with survival. The plan, on paper, looked elegant, combining Hartwell's manufacturing infrastructure with the prestige of the Renaud name to present a stronger, more modern version of both legacies. What the plan required, and what almost no one outside a small circle of accountants fully understood yet, was an enormous amount of outside capital to make it work at all. Renaud Global's finances were worse than even Julian realized. Years of maintaining appearances, flagship stores in cities where the rent alone could sink a smaller company, had buried the business under debt coming due within months. Without an outside investment of nearly $3 billion, Renaud Global would not survive long enough to see the merger finalized, regardless of how promising the partnership looked in a press release. Bianca knew this better than anyone, and it was the real reason she had never once discouraged Julian's attention, even at a party where a pregnant woman was quietly locked out in the rain. While all of this played out in headlines Julian's family was carefully managing, Selena spent her mornings at Ashcroft Capital's Manhattan offices, walking through hallways she hadn't set foot in for 5 years. She didn't announce herself. She simply arrived, and the people who had worked closely with her father greeted her with a formality that confused the newer employees, who assumed she was some old friend of Diane Okafor's being given a courtesy office. Selena let the confusion stand. She wasn't ready yet for anyone outside a small circle to fully understand who had just walked back through the door. Diane Okafor had run Ashcroft Capital's daily operations for 5 years, exactly the way Nathaniel Ashcroft would have wanted. Competent, discreet, and fiercely protective of the Ashcroft family's privacy. When Selena told her over coffee in the office that used to be her father's, that she intended to become more involved again, Diane didn't ask what had happened to bring this on. She simply nodded, pulled up the current pipeline of major deals under review, and started walking Selena through each one, the way she'd been quietly hoping to do for years. Julian, in the meantime, found himself busier and lonelier than he had ever been in his life, surrounded constantly by lawyers and investors and his mother's carefully managed schedule, and yet strangely unmoored without the one person who used to ask him, every single evening, how his day had actually gone. He picked up his phone to call Selena more than once that autumn, got as far as finding her contact in his recent calls, and put the phone back down each time, telling himself it wasn't the right moment yet. Margaret always seemed to sense exactly when these moments happened, and always seemed to have something urgent that needed his attention right then. If you've made it this far into the story, you already know it's about to get a lot more interesting. So take a second right now to like this video and subscribe, because what Julian is about to find out is going to change absolutely everything he thinks he understands about the woman he left standing in the rain. Word eventually reached Julian, through his own legal team, that the fund reviewing Renaud Global's rescue application was a firm called Ashcroft Capital Group, a name neither he nor Bianca recognized as meaning anything beyond another finance company with money to lend. Bianca's own advisors described Ashcroft as unusually selective and unusually private, a fund that rarely gave interviews and almost never attached a public face to its biggest decisions. Run day-to-day by a CEO named Diane Okafor, who answered, according to every source they could find, to a majority shareholder whose identity the firm had never once disclosed. Inside Ashcroft's offices, the Renaud Global file moved through the usual channels of review, junior analysts flagging concerns, senior partners debating risk, until it reached the point every deal of this size eventually reached. Diane mentioned to her team, in a meeting that included nobody outside a small trusted circle, that this particular file would need to go to the shareholder directly for personal sign-off, the same as always, and that she expected it on Selena's desk by the end of the week. Nobody in that meeting had any reason to think the name Hartwell attached to the file would mean anything unusual to their reclusive majority owner. Julian and Bianca's relationship, whatever it actually was beneath the business arrangement holding it together, began showing its own strain as the merger timeline tightened. Bianca grew sharper with him during calls, less patient with delays she blamed on Hartwell's due diligence team, more openly anxious about a deadline that, if missed, would end her family's company regardless of whose name eventually appeared on a merger agreement. Julian found himself managing her moods on top of his own board's growing impatience, discovering, slowly, that being chosen by someone under enormous pressure felt very different from being loved by someone who simply wanted to spend an evening with him. Selena's presence at Ashcroft Capital stopped being a quiet mystery within a few weeks and became, instead, an accepted and increasingly respected part of daily operations. She asked sharp questions in meetings, questions that made clear she understood the business far better than her years away from it might have suggested. Diane began looping her into decisions earlier and earlier, not because the trust required it for every deal, but because Selena's read on a room, on a deal, on a person's real intentions, had become something the senior team genuinely valued. Nobody who worked with her that autumn would have described her as someone's overlooked wife. Margaret spent that same autumn managing the Hartwell family's public image with the same discipline she applied to everything else, making sure any mention of Julian's marriage in the press stayed vague, framed as a private matter unrelated to business, timed carefully around positive coverage of the Renaud partnership. She believed with total confidence that the story of what happened at that gala would fade the way most inconvenient stories eventually did. She had no way of knowing that a much bigger story was already sitting quietly on a desk in Manhattan, waiting. By late autumn, whispers had started circulating among Hartwell's own board about how unusually slow Ashcroft's review process had become, slower than any other rescue deal Renaud Global's advisors had modeled. Julian found himself fielding questions he couldn't answer, about why a fund that had approved similar deals in weeks was taking months on this one. He didn't know, at that point, that the delay had nothing to do with the numbers and everything to do with the fact that the person whose approval mattered most had needed time to decide how she wanted to handle discovering her husband's signature on a file that could make or break his future. The file landed on Selena's desk on a quiet Thursday afternoon, a stack of financial statements and term sheets, like dozens of others she had reviewed since coming back. She opened it without any particular expectation, the way she'd opened every other file that month, and turned to the signature page near the back, the place where every major deal eventually required the counterparty's authorization. Julian Hartwell's signature sat there in familiar handwriting she had watched him use to sign birthday cards and mortgage papers for 3 years. Selena sat very still for a long moment, and then, very deliberately, she kept reading. The time winter arrived, the Renaud global bailout still hadn't cleared Ashcroft's final review, and Bianca's patience had worn down to almost nothing. She called Julian nearly every day that January, her voice tighter each time, reminding him that her family's company had weeks, not months, before creditors stopped waiting politely. She told him to use whatever influence the Hartwell name still carried to find out what was actually holding up the deal, convinced that somewhere in Ashcroft's process, a single phone call from the right person could move things along faster than any amount of paperwork. Julian did exactly that, requesting a direct meeting with Diane Okafor, the only name at Ashcroft Capital that appeared anywhere in public records or press coverage. Margaret came with him to that first meeting, dressed for the kind of negotiation she assumed this would be, prepared to charm or pressure whichever executive actually held the authority to approve the deal. Diane received them politely, answered their questions in careful, measured language, and gave them absolutely nothing that moved the timeline forward, which both Julian and Margaret interpreted as simple corporate caution rather than what it actually was. In the weeks after first seeing Julian's signature on the Renaud file, Selena didn't rush her decision the way anyone watching from the outside might have expected her to. She read every page of the deal multiple times, studied Renaud Global's finances as carefully as she studied any other file that crossed her desk, and made a point of separating, as clearly as she could, what she felt about Julian personally from what the numbers actually said about whether this deal deserved to be funded at all. It was, in its own way, the hardest professional discipline she had ever exercised, and she didn't discuss it with anyone except Thomas. Thomas Reyes sat with Selena one evening that winter and asked her directly whether she was prepared for what handling this deal personally would mean, because approving or rejecting a transaction this size, tied to her own estranged husband's company, would almost certainly pull her identity out of the privacy she'd maintained for 5 years. He reminded her that she could hand the file to another senior partner entirely, step back, and let Ashcroft's normal process run its course without her name ever needing to touch it directly. Selena listened to all of it carefully, and then told him she had no intention of stepping back from this particular decision. Julian finally got a straighter answer in February, from an industry contact who had worked with Ashcroft Capital years earlier and remembered enough about the firm's structure to explain it plainly. Diane Okafor ran the company day to day, the contact told him. But Ashcroft had always operated under an unusual rule left behind by its founder, requiring the personal, private approval of a majority shareholder on anything above a certain size. Nobody outside a small circle at the firm had ever met that shareholder directly. Julian sat with that information for a long time before he called Diane again, this time asking a very different question. When Julian asked Diane directly, who actually held final authority over the Renaud Global decision, Diane gave him the same careful answer she had been giving for months, that the review process followed the firm's standard structure, and that he would be informed when a decision was reached. What she didn't tell him, because it wasn't her place to, was that Selena had already told her, quietly and firmly, that she wanted to deliver this particular decision in person. Diane simply told Julian that a meeting had been scheduled for the following week at Ashcroft's offices, and that all relevant parties should plan to attend. Bianca, unaware of any of the specifics unfolding behind Ashcroft's closed doors, spent that same week fielding calls from her own family's creditors, doing what she could to buy a few more days of patience by promising a resolution was close. She had staked everything: her family's company, her relationship with Julian, her own sense of who she was becoming, on a deal she still didn't fully understand the mechanics of. She told herself, the night before the meeting, that whatever happened tomorrow, she had done everything within her power to save what mattered to her. Selena spent the evening before the meeting at home with Thomas, going over the final terms one more time, though by that point she had made her decision days earlier and simply hadn't told anyone the shape of it yet. She wasn't nervous the way Julian was nervous, and she wasn't triumphant the way a simpler version of this story might expect her to be. She felt, mostly, a strange kind of calm, the calm of someone who had spent months being underestimated by the same people who were about to walk into a room and finally understand exactly who they'd been dealing with the entire time. Julian spent the days leading up to that meeting more anxious than he'd been at any point since taking over Hartwell Industries, running through every possible version of who this shareholder might turn out to be: an aging investor, a foreign fund, a name from some family he'd never heard of. Margaret assured him it was almost certainly a formality, that Ashcroft wouldn't have scheduled a meeting at all if they intended to walk away from $3 billion in fees and interest. Neither of them, walking into that building the following week, had any reason to imagine that the answer to a question that had haunted them for months was about to walk through a boardroom door wearing a face they both knew better than almost anyone else alive. Julian and Margaret arrived at Ashcroft Capital's Manhattan headquarters 10 minutes early, both of them dressed for a negotiation, both of them still assuming they understood exactly what kind of meeting this was going to be. A young assistant led them into a glass-walled boardroom on the 40th floor, the same room, though neither of them yet had reason to notice it, where a very different version of this story had already been glimpsed at the very beginning. Diane Okafor greeted them warmly enough, offered coffee, and told them the shareholder would be joining shortly. The door opened a few minutes later, and Selena Marsh walked in wearing a dark blazer Julian had never seen before, carrying a folder under one arm, moving through the room with the unhurried confidence of someone who had walked into hundreds of meetings exactly like this one. She took the seat at the head of the table without a word of explanation, opened her folder, and looked up at Julian and Margaret with an expression that gave away absolutely nothing about what she was about to say. Julian felt the room tilt in a way he would later struggle to fully describe. His first instinct was confusion, some half-formed assumption that Selena was there as a guest, or an assistant, or some strange coincidence that would resolve itself the moment the real shareholder walked in. That assumption lasted exactly as long as it took Diane to address Selena as the majority shareholder of Ashcroft Capital Group, at which point the color left Julian's face entirely, and he sat very still, staring at the woman he had locked out of his home in the rain 7 months earlier. Selena spoke for several minutes without raising her voice, explaining, in plain terms, that her father, Nathaniel Ashcroft, had built this firm over 3 decades, that she had inherited majority control of it after his death 5 years earlier, and that his trust required her personal approval on any transaction of this size, a condition that had applied to every major deal the firm had made since, whether anyone outside a small circle ever knew about it or not. She told them she had stepped back from public involvement in the business by choice, not out of any lack of capability, and that she saw no particular reason she'd ever needed to explain that choice to people who had never once asked her a real question about her own life. Bianca, seated further down the table, understood the implications faster than either Julian or Margaret did, and her composure cracked in a way she hadn't allowed it to crack in months of managing her family's collapsing finances in front of strangers. She realized in that moment that the woman holding her family's entire future in her hands was the same woman she had watched get humiliated at a party, the same woman whose marriage she had helped unravel without ever once considering that the story might circle back around this directly. Margaret, to her credit, recovered faster than either of the younger people at the table, immediately shifting into the kind of diplomatic language she had used for decades to smooth over difficult situations. She spoke about family, about the years Selena had spent as practically a Hartwell, about how none of what happened at that gala had been meant the way it must have looked. Selena listened to all of it politely, without interrupting, and without a single flicker of the softening Margaret was clearly hoping to see. What made the moment land as hard as it did wasn't anger, because Selena never raised her voice or said a single unkind word to any of them. She simply treated the entire conversation as business, the same way she would have treated any other deal review, asking pointed questions about Renaud Global's finances, about Hartwell Industries' actual capacity to absorb a merger of this size, about whether either company had a realistic plan beyond simply needing the money to survive. Julian answered every question badly, not because he didn't know the business, but because he couldn't stop looking at his wife and trying to understand how he had missed something this large for 3 entire years. After nearly an hour, Selena closed her folder and told the room that she would need additional time before finalizing how she wanted to structure the terms of any potential investment. She thanked them for coming, stood, and left the boardroom exactly the way she had entered it, without raising her voice, without a single dramatic gesture, leaving Julian, Margaret, and Bianca sitting in a room none of them fully recognized anymore, with absolutely no way of knowing whether she intended to save their futures, end them, or something far more complicated than either. The formal terms arrived at both companies' legal departments 5 days later, delivered through Ashcroft Capital's normal channels, without any personal note attached. Ashcroft would fund the full rescue investment, protecting Renaud Global's factories, its smaller shareholders, and every employee whose livelihood had nothing to do with the decisions their leadership had made. The merger with Hartwell Industries would proceed largely as planned, preserving jobs across all 3 states where Hartwell operated. The one condition, non-negotiable and written into every version of the agreement, was that neither Julian Hartwell nor Bianca Renaud would retain a controlling leadership position in the newly merged company. Hartwell Industries survived in name and in structure exactly the way 3 generations of Julian's family had built it. Julian himself did not survive in it, at least not in the role he had spent his entire life preparing for. The board, guided by terms Ashcroft had insisted on as a condition of funding, brought in new leadership within the year. Professionals with no personal history attached to either family, focused entirely on stabilizing a company that could finally stop being used as a bargaining chip in someone else's personal life. By the time all of the paperwork was finalized, Selena had already given birth, a daughter, Born on a quiet morning in early spring with Thomas Reyes in the waiting room instead of Julian. Julian learned about his daughter's birth secondhand, through a brief message from Thomas's office 3 days later, the same way he had learned almost everything important about his own wife over the previous year, after the fact, from someone else, once it no longer required his participation. Selena settled into a life that looked, from the outside, remarkably similar to the one she had always wanted. Quiet mornings, a garden she finally had time to plant properly, and a daughter she raised without a single ounce of the uncertainty that had followed her through the last year of her marriage. She never spoke publicly about what happened at that gala, or the boardroom, or any of it. She didn't need to. The people who mattered already knew exactly what kind of woman had been sitting quietly in that marriage the entire time, mistaken for someone with nothing of her own to offer. There's something worth sitting with in a story like this one, about how easily people mistake quiet for weakness, and how often the person underestimated in a room is the one actually holding it together. Julian spent 3 years assuming he understood exactly who his wife was, right up until the moment a locked gate in the rain turned out to be the beginning of the most expensive lesson of his life. So we'll leave you with a couple of questions before you go. Would you have stayed quiet about who you really were for as long as Selena did, or would you have used that kind of power the very first time someone tried to humiliate you in front of a room full of strangers? And do you think Julian ever really loved the woman he married, or only the version of her he assumed he already understood completely? Let us know what you think in the comments. If this story keeps you watching until the very end, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you never miss the next one. And if you want to see exactly how far someone will go when they've finally been pushed too far, we've got another story waiting for you right after this one. Thanks for watching.